Blood stained the Persian rug, pooling around the most dangerous man in New York. Clara pressed her hands to his chest, terrified. His cold, dark eyes locked onto hers, his voice barely a rasp. "Stay with me just one night," he whispered. She didn't know it would change everything. The unrelenting November rain battered the windows of Clara Hayes' cramped Queens apartment, but she wasn't listening to the storm. She was staring at the blinking screen of her burner phone. It was 2:14 a.m. Clara was an ER nurse at Mount Sinai by day, but by night she worked for Apex Concierge Medicine, a highly discreet, off-the-books medical service catering to New York's ultra-wealthy. It was the only way she could keep her head above water after her ex-husband, a chronic gambler, had skipped town and left her with a crippling six-figure debt owed to the kind of men who didn't send collection letters. The phone buzzed. A text message from Sarah, her dispatcher, Priority Alpha, the St. Regis, New York, penthouse suite, severe trauma, NDA level 5, car is downstairs. Clara grabbed her trauma bag, a heavy reinforced black duffel packed with everything from IV saline to surgical staples, and ran down the narrow stairs of her walk-up. A sleek, black Cadillac Escalade was idling at the curb, its tinted windows impenetrable. The moment she opened the door, a man in a bespoke charcoal suit, whose thick neck and cauliflower ears betrayed a violent past, nodded at her. He didn't speak. He just drove. 15 minutes later, Clara was being escorted through the private service elevators of the St. Regis on Fifth Avenue. The air smelled of expensive rain, tension, and a faint, metallic undercurrent she knew all too well. Blood. The heavy mahogany doors to the penthouse swung open. The sheer opulence of the room, Waterford crystal chandeliers, original oil paintings, and sweeping views of the Manhattan skyline was starkly contrasted by the chaotic scene in the center of the living room. A man was laid out on a massive, custom-built Chesterfield sofa. His shirt, which Clara noted absent-mindedly was a crisp, custom-tailored piece from Brioni, was torn open and soaked in crimson. 3 other men stood around him, weapons drawn and eyes scanning the shadows, turning to glare at Clara as she entered. "Get to work," barked a tall, angular man with prematurely graying hair. This was Silas, though Clara wouldn't learn his name until later. Clara dropped her bag and fell to her knees beside the sofa. She finally looked at her patient, Dominic Russo. Even bleeding out on imported leather, the head of the Russo syndicate exuded a terrifying, gravity-shifting authority. The media called him a real estate magnate behind Russo Holdings. But the whispers in the ER break rooms painted a different picture, a ruthless kingpin who controlled the ports of New Jersey and the illicit diamond trade in the Diamond District. "Where is he hit?" Clara asked, her professional training instantly overriding her rising panic. She snapped on heavy-duty nitrile gloves. "Lower right abdomen," Silas replied, pacing the floor like a caged panther. "Through and through. We think." He refused to go to Columbia Presbyterian. Clara grabbed her trauma shears and cut away the ruined silk and cotton. The wound was ugly, a dark, bubbling entry hole just above the iliac crest. She immediately applied pressure with thick gauze, her hands pressing down hard. Dominic flinched, his jaw tightening, but he didn't make a sound. "I need light," Clara commanded, pointing at a terrified-looking hotel manager who had been forced into the corner. "Bring those floor lamps closer, now!" For the next 45 minutes, the penthouse turned into a makeshift operating theater. Clara worked with desperate precision. She cleaned the wound with betadine, the harsh chemical smell masking the expensive Tom Ford cologne Dominic wore. She dug out a fragmented piece of the jacket that had been pushed into the wound tract, clamped a bleeding artery, and began the arduous process of stitching him back together. Through it all, Dominic was awake. He had refused anything stronger than local lidocaine, insisting he needed a clear head. His eyes, the color of wet obsidian, never left her face. He watched her every movement, studying the slight tremor in her hands that she fought hard to suppress, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, and the absolute, unapologetic authority she commanded when she had a scalpel in her hand. "You're shaking," Dominic murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated against her hands where they rested on his chest. "You're bleeding on a $50,000 sofa," Clara shot back, tying off a heavy silk suture. "I think we both have things to complain about." A faint ghost of a smile touched his pale lips. "What's your name?" "Nurse," she said flatly. "And you need to keep quiet. Your blood pressure is already tanking." She hooked him up to 2 bags of O-negative blood she had brought in her specialized cooler, monitoring his vitals on a portable screen. By 4:30 a.m., the bleeding had stopped, the wound was closed, and the immediate danger of hypovolemic shock had passed. Clara stood up, stripping off her bloody gloves and throwing them into a biohazard bag. She was physically drained, her back aching and her scrubs stained. "He needs strict bed rest," Clara told Silas, who had finally stopped pacing. Heavy antibiotics. I've started him on a broad-spectrum IV drip. Watch for fever. If his temperature spikes past 101, you bring him to a real hospital, or he dies of sepsis. Understood? Silas nodded grimly. Clara picked up her trauma bag, slinging the heavy strap over her shoulder. My fee goes to the agency. I'm leaving. She turned toward the door, desperate to get back to the anonymity of the rain in her miserable apartment. But before she could take a step, a large, heavy hand wrapped around her wrist. Despite the blood loss, Dominic's grip was like iron. She looked back down at him. The imposing Mafia boss pulled her slightly closer, ignoring the frantic protests of his men. Stay with me just one night, Dominic whispered, the words carrying a weight that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Clara froze, her pulse hammering against Dominic's calloused thumb. She tried to pull her arm back, but his grip remained steadfast. I have a shift at Mount Sinai at noon, Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady, attempting to inject a dose of mundane reality into a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of her control. I've stabilized you. My job here is done. Dominic's eyes flicked to Silas. The grey-haired underboss stepped forward, his expression entirely devoid of empathy. Mrs. Hayes, Silas said, using her legal name, which she had never given them. Your ex-husband, Thomas, owes $85,000 to a loan shark named Mickey the Razor Sullivan, a man who operates out of a meatpacking plant in the Bronx. Currently, Mickey believes you are responsible for that debt. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees suddenly felt weak. How do you... We know everything, Clara, Dominic interrupted softly, finally releasing her wrist. He shifted on the couch, grimacing slightly at the pain. The men who shot me tonight, they aren't just street thugs. They are professionals. And they have eyes on this hotel. What does that have to do with me? Clara demanded, her voice rising in panic. I came through the service entrance. Nobody saw me. They saw the Escalade. Silas corrected. They know someone came up here. If you walk out of that lobby right now, alone, they will follow you. They will assume you know who hit him, or worse, they will use you to get back to him. You are a loose end, Clara. And in our world, loose ends get cut. Clara looked between the two men, the crushing weight of reality settling over her. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was collateral. So, what? Clara asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. I'm a hostage? You are under my protection, Dominic corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. For tonight, until my men sweep the perimeter and neutralize the threat. You stay here, in the penthouse. You monitor my fever. Tomorrow, when it's safe, Silas will not only ensure you get home, but he will also make a phone call to Mickey Sullivan. Your debt will be erased. Clara stared at him. $85,000. It was a suffocating weight that had cost her sleep, her marriage, and her peace of mind for 2 years. With one phone call, this man could make it disappear. But the price was stepping firmly over the line into his dark, violent world. One night, Clara repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. One night, Dominic confirmed. She dropped her heavy trauma bag back onto the floor. I need fresh scrubs and a lot of black coffee. The next few hours were a surreal blur. The St. Regis penthouse, with its sweeping views of Central Park, became a gilded cage. Silas arranged for a female hotel staff member to bring up a set of dark silk loungewear and a staggering spread of room service from the King Cole bar downstairs, steak frites, black truffles, and endless carafes of espresso. Clara changed in the marble bathroom, locking the door, leaning her forehead against the cool mirror, and trying to steady her breathing. When she returned to the living room, Dominic had been moved to the master bedroom. He was propped up against a mountain of pillows, an IV line snaking into the back of his hand. Despite his pallor, the sheer force of his presence dominated the room. Clara pulled a velvet armchair next to the bed and sat down, checking his vitals on the monitor. You don't belong in this life, Dominic said quietly into the dimly lit room. Neither do you, judging by the extra hole in your side, Clara retorted, refusing to be intimidated. Dominic chuckled, a low sound that turned into a grimace of pain. Touché. I was born into it. My father built Russo Holdings with blood and concrete. I modernized it. But there are always those who prefer the old, violent ways. Over the next few hours, in the quiet intimacy of the guarded room, an uneasy truce formed between them. Clara learned that Dominic wasn't just a brutal enforcer. He was a brilliantly calculated strategist who spent his time reading Marcus Aurelius and managing a multi-billion-dollar international shipping logistics network. He noticed things about her too, the way she meticulously organized her medical tools, the exhausted shadows under her eyes, the fierce independence that masked her underlying fear. By 10 p.m., the storm outside had broken, revealing a sharp, glittering Manhattan skyline. Dominic's fever was holding steady at a low 99.5 degrees. Clara was just beginning to let her guard down, sipping a lukewarm coffee, when the heavy oak door to the bedroom cracked open. It was Silas. But something was wrong. His suit jacket was off, his tie was loose, and the expression on his face was tight, anxious. "Dominic," Silas said, stepping into the room. "The perimeter sweep is done, the hitmen are gone." Dominic narrowed his eyes, sensing the shift in his underboss's demeanor. And Silas said, pulling a suppressed Heckler and Koch USP tactical pistol from his waistband, pointing it squarely at Dominic's chest. "I'm sorry, Dom. The Italians offered me the entire New Jersey Port Authority. I can't say no to that." Clara dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the hardwood floor, dark liquid splashing across her bare feet. The hit hadn't been from a rival family. It was an inside job. "Silas," Dominic said, his voice dangerously calm, not moving an inch. "You pull that trigger, you won't make it to the elevator. My men are outside." "Your men are currently drinking poisoned scotch in the lobby," Silas sneered. "It's over, Dominic." Silas adjusted his aim, his finger tightening on the trigger. In a split second of pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct, Clara didn't scream or cower. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy, stainless steel oxygen tank resting beside the bed, and swung it with all her might. The heavy metal cylinder slammed into Silas's wrist. There was a sickening crack, and the suppressed pistol discharged wildly, the bullet shattering the bedroom window, sending a shower of safety glass raining down into the room. Silas roared in pain, dropping the gun. "Clara, run!" Dominic shouted, throwing off his blankets and ignoring his torn abdomen. He lunged for the dropped weapon, tackling Silas to the floor in a brutal tangle of limbs. "I'm not leaving you!" Clara screamed over the chaos. Dominic drove his elbow into Silas's jaw, knocking the traitor out cold. Panting, bleeding anew through his bandages, Dominic grabbed the pistol and staggered to his feet. He looked at Clara, his eyes blazing, with a mixture of pain, rage, and a terrifying kind of awe at what she had just done. "Change of plans," the Mafia boss grunted, grabbing her hand, smearing his blood against her skin. "We need to leave. Now." The echo of the gunshot was still ringing in Clara's ears as Dominic pulled her into the opulent hallway of the St. Regis. The air in the corridor was thick, smelling of sulfur and the sharp tang of copper. Dominic moved with a terrifying singular focus, his left hand pressing a fresh, blood-soaked towel against his side, his right hand gripping the stolen Heckler and Koch pistol. "The elevators are a death trap," Dominic grunted, his breathing shallow. He kicked open the heavy fire door leading to the service stairwell. "We take the stairs. Stay behind me." "You just had major abdominal surgery," Clara protested, her medical instincts warring with her sheer terror. "If you tear those internal sutures, you will bleed out internally before we hit the lobby." Dominic paused on the landing, turning back to look at her. The dim, fluorescent lighting of the stairwell cast harsh shadows over his sharp cheekbones and the dark, predatory intensity of his eyes. "If we stay here, Clara, we don't bleed out. We just get put in body bags. Now, move." They began the agonizing descent from the penthouse. 30 floors. With every step, Clara watched the muscles in Dominic's back tense and shudder beneath his ruined, bloody shirt. She stayed close, her hand hovering just inches from his shoulder, ready to catch him if his knees buckled. The silence of the stairwell was suffocating, broken only by the squeak of their shoes on the concrete and the ragged rhythm of Dominic's breathing. By the 15th floor, the adrenaline that had fueled Dominic's attack on Silas was wearing off. He stumbled, his shoulder slamming hard against the cinder block wall. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips. "Stop," Clara commanded, her voice dropping the tremble it had held earlier. She stepped in front of him, physically pressing her hands against his chest to halt his momentum. "Let me look." "We don't have time." "I don't care," Clara snapped, pulling the bloody towel away from his side. Fresh, bright red blood was seeping through the thick gauze she had applied barely an hour ago. The sutures were holding, but the surrounding tissue was bruising angrily. "You're tearing the muscle fascia? You need to lean on me." Dominic looked down at her. She was a foot shorter than him, wearing borrowed, oversized silk loungewear, her hair falling out of its messy bun. Yet, in that dimly lit stairwell, she looked entirely fearless. Without a word, he draped his heavy right arm over her shoulders, shifting a third of his weight onto her frame. Together, the Mafia boss and the ER nurse limped down the remaining flights. They bypassed the ground floor, descending into the subterranean levels of the hotel, The air grew damp and smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. Dominic navigated the labyrinthine sub-basement with the familiarity of a man who always planned his exits. They emerged into a private, VIP subterranean garage reserved for high-profile diplomats and billionaires. Dominic limped toward a nondescript, charcoal-grey Audi RS6 parked in the darkest corner of the concrete cavern. He reached under the front driver's side wheel well, his bloody fingers retrieving a magnetic lockbox. A second later, the car chirped, unlocking. "You drive," Dominic said, tossing her the keys as he heavily folded himself into the passenger seat, letting his head fall back against the leather headrest. "FDR Drive, heading south. Get us to Brooklyn." Clara slid into the driver's seat. Her hands were shaking violently as she gripped the steering wheel, slipping slightly on the residual blood from Dominic's skin. She pushed the push-to-start ignition, and the twin-turbo V8 engine roared to life, a low, menacing growl that echoed off the concrete walls. "Where in Brooklyn?" Clara asked, throwing the car into drive and accelerating up the ramp. "Brooklyn Heights, Pineapple Street," Dominic rasped, his eyes closed. "Look for a storefront called Gable's Antiquities." And Clara? "What?" she asked, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror as they burst out of the garage and into the rain-slick streets of Midtown Manhattan. "Drive fast, and if anyone tries to box us in, you don't hit the brakes, you run them over." The drive was a blur of neon lights, streaking raindrops, and sheer panic. Clara navigated the FDR Drive with reckless precision, weaving through the sparse 3 a.m. traffic. Dominic remained silent, his skin growing increasingly pale, a thin sheen of cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The fever was returning, accompanied by the undeniable reality of massive blood loss. They crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, the suspension cables flashing by like the bars of a cage. Clara followed Dominic's strained directions, winding through the cobblestone streets of Brooklyn Heights until she spotted the faded gold lettering of Gable's Antiquities. She threw the Audi into park, the tires screeching against the curb. Before she could even cut the engine, the heavy oak door of the antique shop opened. A man stepped out into the rain. He was in his late 60s, wearing a tweed vest over a rolled-up dress shirt, holding a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun casually at his side. This was Harrison Harry Gable, a retired Irish mob fixer who now brokered high-end art and hid high-value targets for the Russo family. Harry took one look at the Audi, lowered the weapon, and jogged to the passenger side. He hauled Dominic out of the car. "Christ, Dom," Harry muttered, his thick Brooklyn accent cutting through the rain. "You look like a slaughtered pig. Inside. Now." Harry's shop was a chaotic maze of first edition books, dusty globes, and 17th century maps. But the back room, hidden behind a heavy, steel-reinforced bookshelf, was a state-of-the-art safe room, complete with a hospital bed, a fully stocked medical supply cabinet, and a reinforced steel door. "Get him on the bed," Clara ordered, her professional persona slamming back into place the moment she saw the medical supplies. She was no longer a terrified hostage. She was in her element. For the second time that night, Clara went to work. She re-sterilized the wound, applying specialized hemostatic combat gauze Harry provided to stop the deep tissue bleeding. She hung a fresh bag of saline and pumped him full of broad-spectrum IV antibiotics. Harry stood by silently, handing her instruments with the calm precision of a seasoned combat medic. By 6 a.m., the gray light of dawn was creeping through the heavily frosted skylight of the safe room. Dominic was asleep, his breathing finally deep and even. His fever had broken. Clara collapsed into a worn leather armchair in the corner of the room, her adrenaline crashing so hard it made her teeth chatter. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs, staring at the man in the bed. "You did good, kid," Harry said softly, handing her a mug of strong black tea laced with a heavy pour of Jameson whiskey. "Not many civilians could handle what you saw tonight without losing their minds." "I'm not a civilian," Clara whispered, staring into the dark amber liquid. "I'm a nurse. I fix things that are broken." "Well," Harry sighed, looking at Dominic, "you certainly picked the most broken man in New York to fix." Clara woke with a start, disoriented by the smell of old paper, iodine, and gun oil. She was still in the leather armchair, a thick wool blanket draped over her. The digital clock on the medical monitor read 2:15 p.m. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, and froze. Dominic was awake. He was sitting up slightly, the hospital bed angled to support his back. He was shirtless, his chest wrapped in pristine white bandages, a stark contrast to the dark, intricate tattoos that inked his left shoulder and arm. He was holding a burner phone to his ear, his voice a low, lethal murmur. "I want the ports locked down," Dominic was saying, his dark eyes locking onto Clara the moment she stirred. Nobody moves a single shipping container without my explicit authorization. If the Italians think Silas handed them the keys to my kingdom, let them try to turn the lock. Find Silas. Bring him to me alive. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bedside table. For a long moment, he just looked at her. The harsh fluorescent lights of the safe room had been turned off, replaced by the soft, warm glow of a brass reading lamp. In this light, stripped of his bespoke suits and his intimidating entourage, Dominic Rousseau looked alarmingly human. You stayed, Dominic said quietly. I didn't exactly have a choice, Clara replied, pushing the blanket off and standing up. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed. Where was I going to go? Mickey Sullivan still thinks I owe him $85,000. And your traitorous underboss probably put a hit out on me the moment we escaped. Dominic's jaw tightened. About that. Clara stopped, a cold knot forming in her stomach. What? I just spoke to my intelligence broker, Dominic said, shifting slightly, suppressing a wince. Silas didn't act alone, and he didn't orchestrate this hit overnight. He's been planning this coup for months. He needed heavy, untraceable weaponry to bypass my security at the St. Regis. He got those weapons from the Irish crews in the Bronx. Mickey Sullivan, Clara breathed, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Yes, Dominic confirmed. But it goes deeper, Clara. Silas knew I used Apex concierge medicine. He knew I preferred off-the-books medical care for emergencies. He needed a way to monitor the agency, to know exactly when and where I would be vulnerable if an assassination attempt failed, and I needed immediate care. Clara shook her head, not wanting to understand. No, Thomas. Your ex-husband, Dominic said gently, his voice devoid of its usual cold command. Silas engineered Thomas's debt. He used Sullivan to squeeze Thomas, forcing him to flee, leaving the debt to you. They knew you were an Apex nurse. They used that debt to put a tracker on your phone, Clara. They used you to find me. The room spun. Clara gripped the back of the leather armchair, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just collateral damage. Her entire nightmare, the sleepless nights, the terrifying phone calls from Guatgars, the crushing weight of the debt that had destroyed her life, was orchestrated by the mob just to get to the man sitting in the bed. She had been a pawn on a bloody chessboard she didn't even know existed. Tears of pure, unadulterated rage pricked her eyes. You ruined my life, she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury that surprised even her. Your world, your petty, violent little wars, it ruined my life. Dominic didn't defend himself. He didn't look away. I know. You know? Clara snapped, stepping toward the bed, the fear evaporating, replaced by a blazing anger. My husband left me. I work 80 hours a week just to keep my kneecaps from being shattered by a man named the Razor. And you sit there and say, I know? Before she could yell another word, Dominic reached out. Despite his injuries, his reflexes were blindingly fast. He caught her hand, pulling her forward until she was forced to brace her other hand on the mattress, her face inches from his. I know, Dominic repeated, his voice a fierce, low rumble, his dark eyes burning into hers. And I swear to you, Clara, on the soul of my father, I will dismantle Mickey Sullivan's operation brick by brick. I will wipe his name from the streets of this city. Your debt is gone. The men who did this to you are dead. They just haven't stopped breathing yet. His grip on her hand wasn't painful, but it was absolute. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a surprisingly tender gesture from hands that had undoubtedly taken lives. The proximity was intoxicating. Clara could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the clean scent of soap mixed with the lingering metallic tang of survival. The anger draining out of her left a terrifying vacuum, quickly filled by a different, infinitely more dangerous emotion. The adrenaline, the shared trauma, the primal reality of surviving the night had stripped away the polite boundaries of society. Dominic, she breathed, a warning she didn't mean. He moved his free hand up, his rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw, tangling in the loose strands of her hair at the nape of her neck. You saved my life twice in 12 hours, Clara. You're not just a nurse anymore. You're mine to protect. He pulled her down. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperation, relief, and an underlying dark possessiveness that sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. Clara gasped against his mouth, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers tangled in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, kissing him back with a fierce answering hunger that matched his own. It was reckless. It was a mistake. But in the shadow of death, it was the only thing that felt real. Crash. The violent splintering of wood echoed from the front of the antique shop, instantly shattering the moment. Dominic broke the kiss, his eyes snapping open, instantly shifting from a lover back to a predator. He shoved Clara behind him, ignoring his stitches as he grabbed the heckler and cock from the nightstand, racking the slide with a sharp metallic clack. From the front of the store, Harry's voice roared, "Get the hell out of my shop!" It was followed by the deafening roar of Harry's shotgun, then a rapid, terrifying burst of automatic gunfire. "Sullivan's men," Dominic hissed, his jaw clenched in pure fury. He looked at Clara, pressing a spare magazine into her hand. "The tracker on your phone. They followed the signal before I crushed it. Stay behind the steel door. Lock it." "What about you?" Clara cried, panic surging back. "I'm going to collect your debt," Dominic said, his eyes utterly merciless as he stepped out of the safe room and into the fray. The heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging Clara into the dim, terrifying isolation of the safe room. She threw the heavy deadbolt, her hands slick with a cold sweat. Outside, the world was ending. The muffled, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a suppressed automatic weapon answered the booming roar of Harry Gable's shotgun. Glass shattered, thousands of dollars of 17th century antiques, exploding into deadly shrapnel. She backed away from the door until her spine hit the cool metal of the medical supply cabinet. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The spare magazine Dominic had given her clutched so tightly that the sharp metal edges bit into her palm. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds of slaughter. She was Clara Hayes, a nurse from Queens. She spent her days arguing with insurance providers and her nights patching up wealthy socialites. She did not belong in a subterranean bunker in Brooklyn Heights listening to a Mafia turf war. Yet, the taste of Dominic Russo's kiss was still burning on her lips, a reckless, intoxicating fire that defied all logic. The gunfire outside raged for what felt like an eternity but was likely only 3 minutes. The sharp smell of cordite and pulverized drywall seeped beneath the crack of the steel door, stinging her nostrils. Then, abruptly, the shooting stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the shop, broken only by the sound of rain hammering against the frosted skylight above. Clara held her breath. "Dominic," she whispered into the empty room. Nothing. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached the safe room. They didn't have the measured, predatory grace of Dominic's stride. Someone jiggled the handle. Clara scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She raised the heavy spare magazine, a pathetic weapon against whatever was waiting on the other side. "Open the door, Clara," a voice rasped through the steel. It wasn't Dominic, it wasn't Mickey Sullivan. It was a voice she recognized from the penthouse, laced with pain and raw fury. Silas. "Go to hell!" she shouted back, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror freezing her veins. "Sullivan's men are dead," Silas coughed, the sound wet and ugly. "Harry is bleeding out by the register. Dominic took 2 rounds to the chest. He's done. You have 30 seconds to open this door before I use the breaching charge I took off a dead Irishman. You open it, I make it quick. You make me blow it, I take my time." Clara's world tilted. Dominic was down. The invincible kingpin who had sworn to protect her was bleeding out on a floor covered in shattered porcelain. A wave of profound, devastating grief washed over her, instantly followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. She wasn't going to die cowering in a closet. She looked around frantically. Her medical bag was empty. The oxygen tank she had used to smash Silas's wrist was miles away at the St. Regis. She grabbed a heavy, stainless steel surgical scalpel from the tray, gripping it tightly in her right hand. 10 seconds, Silas warned. Clara didn't answer. She positioned herself to the side of the doorframe, hidden from the immediate line of sight. A deafening explosion rocked the safe room. The heavy steel door blew inward off its hinges, crashing onto the hospital bed in a cloud of grey smoke and pulverized concrete. The concussive wave knocked Clara off her feet, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Through the settling dust, Silas stepped into the room. He looked horrific. His expensive suit was shredded, his face bruised and swollen from where Dominic had struck him, and his right arm hung uselessly at his side. But in his left hand he held a Glock 19, sweeping the room. He spotted her on the floor. A cruel, bloody smile stretched across his face. "There you are, nurse. You cost me a multi-million-dollar empire tonight." He raised the gun, aiming right at her chest. Before his finger could tighten on the trigger, a dark, blood-soaked shadow materialized in the doorway behind him. Dominic Russo was not dead. He was battered, his bandages soaked through with fresh crimson, but his eyes burned with the fury of a demon dragged straight from the depths of hell. He moved with a terrifying silence, lunging forward and wrapping his arm around Silas's throat in a brutal chokehold. Silas choked, firing wildly into the ceiling as Dominic wrenched his arm upward, forcing him to drop the weapon. The two men crashed to the floor in a desperate, ugly struggle. Dominic was fighting purely on adrenaline and rage, his surgical wounds tearing wide open. Silas, desperate and cornered, drove his thumb directly into Dominic's bleeding abdomen. Dominic let out a guttural roar of agony, his grip faltering. Silas shoved him off, scrambling for the dropped Glock. "Clara!" Dominic choked out, his hand pressing against his ruined side. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the dusty floor, grabbing the Glock just as Silas's fingers brushed the grip. She rolled onto her back, raised the heavy weapon with both hands, and aimed it squarely at the traitor's chest. Silas froze, looking down the barrel of his own gun, held by the terrified ER nurse from Queens. "You won't do it," he sneered, though a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. "You take a life, you can never go back to yours. You're a healer, Clara, not a killer." Clara looked at Silas, the man who had manipulated her ex-husband, trapped her in debt, and tried to murder the man she had spent the last 12 hours saving. She looked at Dominic, bleeding on the floor, watching her with a breathless intensity. "My life was over the second I walked into that penthouse," Clara said, her voice dropping to a dead, icy calm. She pulled the trigger. Twice. The gunshots were deafening in the small room. Silas staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing in a lifeless heap against the shattered medical cabinet. The gun slipped from Clara's numb fingers, clattering against the concrete. She sat there, staring at the body, her breathing ragged and shallow. She had crossed the line. There was no going back to Mount Sinai. There was no going back to the miserable apartment. A heavy, warm hand touched her shoulder. Dominic knelt beside her, ignoring his own excruciating pain. He gently turned her face away from Silas's body, forcing her to look into his dark, mesmerizing eyes. "It's over," Dominic whispered, his thumb brushing a streak of dust from her cheek. "I've got you. I killed him," she choked out, a sob finally breaking through her stoic facade. "No," Dominic corrected fiercely, pulling her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her trembling frame. "You survived. We survived." From the front of the shop, the sound of heavy boots and urgent voices broke the silence. "Boss! Dom!" It was Lorenzo, Dominic's most loyal capo, arriving with a dozen heavily armed men. Dominic kissed the top of her head, resting his chin on her hair. "Harry," he shouted back. "Alive!" Lorenzo called out. "Paramedics are on the way. The street is secured. Sullivan's crew is wiped out." Dominic looked down at Clara, who was clinging to his ruined shirt like a lifeline. The rain outside was finally stopping, the first pale rays of dawn breaking over the Brooklyn skyline. "Your debt is paid, Clara," he murmured softly against her ear. "The world that broke you is gone. I'm going to build you a new one." She looked up at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. She wasn't a hostage anymore. She wasn't just a nurse. She was the woman who had saved the King of New York, and in doing so, became his queen. That's the epic finale of Clara and Dominic's story. From a struggling ER nurse to the untouchable queen of the Russo Syndicate, staying just one night changed her destiny forever. Did you expect Clara to pull the trigger? If you loved this Mafia romance drama, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below. What would you have done?